The swing set still creaked in the autumn wind, its chains worn smooth by small hands that would never touch them again. In the backyard of 47 Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa, the wooden playset stood like a monument to a life interrupted, painted yellow by a father who believed in bright tomorrows, now faded to the color of old photographs. October 15, 2010, had started like any other Friday. Sarah Chen Morrison, 3 years old with her mother's delicate features and her father's stubborn cowlick, had spent the morning humming a song she'd learned from her grandmother, a gentle Chinese lullaby about paper boats floating down rivers toward home. Her voice, sweet and off-key in the way only toddlers can manage, drifted through the kitchen window as Linda Morrison prepared lunch, occasionally glancing out to watch her daughter push her toy shopping cart around the small garden. The backyard was enclosed by a 6-foot privacy fence that David Morrison had installed himself the previous spring, complete with a child-proof latch that Sarah hadn't yet learned to operate. It was their safe haven, a 30 by 40-foot rectangle of carefully maintained grass, where Sarah could play while Linda worked from her home office, translating documents for the local immigration services. The Morrisons had chosen this house specifically for its yard, a rare commodity in their price range, believing that children needed space to run, to explore, to sing their grandmother's songs under the vast Iowa sky. At 12:47 p.m., Linda called Sarah in for lunch. The backyard was empty. The toy shopping cart sat abandoned near the sandbox, a small plastic banana still clutched in its wire basket. The gate remained latched from the inside. There were no footprints in the freshly turned soil of the flower bed, no signs of struggle, no indication that anyone had ever been there at all, except for a child's red sneaker, size 7, sitting perfectly placed on the bottom step of the slide, as if someone had carefully removed it before disappearing into thin air. The Cedar Falls Police Department responded within minutes of Linda's frantic 911 call. Officer Janet Reeves, a 20-year veteran who had seen her share of missing children cases, arrived to find Linda Morrison standing in the center of the backyard, calling Sarah's name with increasing desperation while clutching the abandoned sneaker to her chest. David Morrison pulled into the driveway as the first patrol cars arrived, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and a terror so profound it seemed to age him decades in the span of minutes. The search began immediately. Neighbors emerged from their houses, forming search parties that combed through every garage, shed, and basement within a 2-mile radius. The local fire department deployed cadaver dogs. Volunteers from 3 counties showed up with flashlights and hand-drawn flyers featuring Sarah's school picture, the one where she was missing her 2 front teeth and grinning with uncontainable joy. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation took over the case within hours, treating the backyard as a crime scene, while also considering the possibility that Sarah had somehow escaped the yard on her own and was simply lost. But Cedar Falls was a town of just over 39,000 people, the kind of place where strangers were noticed and children were watched over by an entire community. Sarah Chen Morrison was not just another missing child statistic. She was the little girl who sang in the grocery store checkout line, who waved at the mail carrier every morning, who had charmed her way into the hearts of everyone from the pediatric nurses at Sartori Hospital to the elderly man who ran the corner newsstand downtown. The investigation consumed the town. Tips poured in from across the Midwest. Sarah had been spotted at a rest stop in Nebraska, at a McDonald's in Wisconsin, boarding a bus in Chicago. Each lead was pursued with methodical determination, each sighting investigated and ultimately dismissed. Security footage from every business within 50 miles was reviewed. Known sex offenders were questioned and re-questioned. The Morrisons' phone records, bank statements, and personal relationships were scrutinized with the thoroughness that comes when a community refuses to accept that one of their children could simply vanish. Linda Morrison aged visibly during those first few weeks, her already slight frame becoming gaunt as she refused to eat, refused to sleep, refused to accept any reality that didn't include Sarah walking back through their front door. She carried that single red sneaker everywhere, clutching it during interviews with investigators, holding it while she made desperate pleas on local television news programs. David threw himself into the search with manic energy, organizing volunteer efforts, printing thousands of flyers, driving hundreds of miles to follow up on tips that proved fruitless. Their marriage, solid before Sarah's disappearance, began to fracture under the weight of shared grief and the terrible silence that had replaced their daughter's laughter. The Chinese community in Cedar Falls, small but tight-knit, rallied around the Morrisons with quiet determination. Sarah's grandmother, Mei Chen, had taught her granddaughter the lullaby about paper boats during weekly visits, singing it in Mandarin while Sarah attempted to follow along with her limited vocabulary and unlimited enthusiasm. Now Mei sat in their living room day after day, speaking to her daughter in hushed tones about hope and faith, while her eyes betrayed the growing certainty that Sarah was gone forever. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Cedar Falls in snow that felt like a burial shroud over the community's hope. The search efforts continued, but with less frequency, fewer volunteers. The FBI had officially classified Sarah's case as a presumed kidnapping, though they had no suspects, no ransom demands, no concrete evidence that she had been taken by anyone at all. The reward fund, started by local businesses and fed by donations from strangers across the country, grew to $125,000, a fortune that remained unclaimed because Sarah Chen Morrison had vanished as completely as if she had never existed at all. By Christmas of 2010, the daily searches had stopped. The Volunteer Command Center in the Cedar Falls Community Center was quietly closed. The yellow ribbons that had adorned trees throughout the neighborhood began to fade and fray, eventually disappearing entirely. Life in Cedar Falls moved forward with the determined normalcy of a community trying to heal from a wound that had no explanation, no closure, no endpoint except the terrible knowledge that some questions have no answers. If stories like this move you in ways you can't quite explain, you might want to subscribe, because sometimes the most profound truths are found in the spaces between what we know and what we hope. The Morrison house on Maple Street remained unchanged, a shrine to a life cut short. The swing set continued to creak in the wind. Sarah's bedroom stayed exactly as she had left it, down to the picture books scattered on the floor and the stuffed elephant she'd named Mr. Peanuts sitting on her pillow. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind was just right, neighbors swore they could still hear the faint sound of a child's voice humming a Chinese lullaby about paper boats floating down rivers toward home. Though whether it was memory or hope or something else entirely, no one could say. The case file remained open, gathering dust in the Cedar Falls Police Department, waiting for a break that might never come. Sarah Chen Morrison had become another name on a list of missing children, another family destroyed by circumstances that defied explanation, another reminder that in America, children could disappear without a trace, leaving behind only questions and the echo of songs that would never be finished. 8 years is both a lifetime and an instant when you're waiting for someone who may never come home. By 2018, Cedar Falls had learned to live with the ghost of Sarah Chen Morrison, her disappearance woven into the town's collective memory like a scar that had healed but never fully faded. The missing child posters had long since been taken down from store windows and telephone poles, replaced by advertisements for school fundraisers and community events. But Sarah's absence remained a persistent ache in the hearts of those who had known her. Linda Morrison had returned to work 18 months after Sarah's disappearance, taking a position with a larger translation service in nearby Waterloo that allowed her to focus on documents rather than people, words rather than faces that might remind her of the daughter she had lost. The commute gave her purpose and distraction, 45 minutes each way through Iowa farmland that changed with the seasons, but never demanded conversation or sympathy or the well-meaning questions that still followed her through the grocery store in Cedar Falls. She had learned to navigate the world as a woman defined by loss, carrying herself with the careful composure of someone who had discovered that grief was not a temporary condition, but a permanent alteration of identity. David Morrison had not been as successful in his adaptation to their new reality. The construction business he had built over 15 years slowly crumbled as he became unable to concentrate on blueprints and building schedules, his mind constantly wandering to search scenarios and investigative theories. By 2013, he had sold the business and taken a job as a maintenance supervisor at the University of Northern Iowa, work that was steady but undemanding, allowing him the mental space to continue his private investigation into Sarah's disappearance. His home office had become a command center of sorts, with maps marked with red pins indicating every reported sighting, binders full of police reports and FBI correspondence, and a wall covered with photographs of Sarah taken from every angle, at every age, as if documentation could somehow bring her back. Their marriage had ended quietly in 2014, not with anger or accusations, but with the mutual recognition that they had become two people drowning in the same ocean, unable to save each other. Linda moved to a small apartment near her office in Waterloo, taking only her clothes and a few photographs. David remained in the house on Maple Street, unable to sell the place where Sarah had lived, unwilling to abandon the backyard where she had last been seen. He maintained the property with obsessive care, painting the fence every 2 years, keeping the grass trimmed to exactly the height Sarah would have remembered, preserving the swing set even as rust began to claim the chains and weather warped the wooden seats. Mei Chen, Sarah's grandmother, had aged dramatically in the years following her granddaughter's disappearance. The woman who had once filled the Morrison house with the sound of Mandarin conversations and the smell of traditional dumplings now moved through the world with the fragile precision of someone carrying precious cargo. She continued her weekly visits to David's house, bringing groceries and companionship, though their shared conversations had become exercises in careful avoidance of the topics that mattered most. She still hummed the lullaby she had taught Sarah, but only when she thought no one was listening, as if the melody itself had become too sacred for casual use. The Cedar Falls Police Department had officially scaled back active investigation into Sarah's case by 2015, though Detective Mark Rodriguez, who had taken over the file from the original investigators, continued to follow up on tips that trickled in with decreasing frequency. The reward fund had been reduced to $50,000, and the FBI had reclassified the case to cold status, which meant that Sarah's file would remain open indefinitely, but would only be actively pursued if new evidence emerged. Rodriguez, a father of 3 daughters himself, kept Sarah's school photograph taped to his computer monitor, not because he believed he would find her, but because he could not bear the thought of her being forgotten entirely. The community of Cedar Falls had also evolved in its relationship with Sarah's memory. The annual Hope Walk, held every October 15th on the anniversary of her disappearance, had grown from a desperate search effort into a memorial celebration of missing children nationwide, drawing participants from across Iowa. The local elementary school had established the Sarah Chen Morrison Memorial Garden, where students planted flowers each spring and learned about safety and community responsibility. Sarah had become both symbol and cautionary tale, her story told to new generations as a reminder that evil could visit even the safest places, that children could vanish even from the most protected environments. But by 2018, Sarah Chen Morrison was more memory than active investigation, more symbol than missing person. The case had generated numerous theories over the years: opportunistic kidnapping by a stranger passing through town, family involvement that had been expertly concealed, accidental death followed by panic-driven cover-up, even the possibility that Sarah had somehow escaped the yard and met with misadventure in the Cedar River that ran behind the neighborhood. Each theory had been investigated and found lacking in evidence. Sarah had not been found alive or dead, had left no trace of her passage through the world beyond that single red sneaker and the testimonies of those who remembered her voice. The passage of time had brought other missing children to public attention, other families to the terrible club that Linda and David Morrison had unwillingly joined. Amber alerts for lost children now triggered an automatic response of shared Facebook posts and watchful eyes, but the urgency faded quickly when the children were found safe or when the investigation moved beyond local interest. Sarah's case had become a historical footnote in the annals of unsolved mysteries, referenced occasionally in true crime podcasts and amateur detective forums, but no longer commanding the attention that had once mobilized an entire community. Linda Morrison had stopped checking the amateur investigation websites, where internet sleuths continued to debate the details of Sarah's disappearance. She had learned to avoid the grocery store aisles where children's cereal was displayed, had trained herself not to turn when she heard a child laugh in a way that sounded familiar. She had built a life around the careful management of triggers and memories, creating routines that allowed her to function without constantly confronting the absence that had defined her existence for 8 years. David Morrison had not been as successful in creating emotional distance. He continued to drive past elementary schools during dismissal time, studying the faces of children who would now be Sarah's age, looking for some combination of features that might indicate his daughter had survived and grown up somewhere else. He maintained active communication with parents of other missing children, sharing information and theories through online support groups that served as both lifeline and prison for families who could not move forward. The house on Maple Street had become a time capsule, preserved exactly as it had been on October 15, 2010. Sarah's bedroom remained untouched, her toys arranged precisely as she had left them, her clothes still hanging in the closet sized for a 3-year-old. David had refused suggestions from well-meaning friends and family members that he should donate Sarah's belongings to charity, unable to accept that she would not someday return to need them. The backyard, too, remained unchanged. The same swing set, the same sandbox, the same flower beds where Linda had once searched for footprints that never materialized. Nashville in the summer of 2018 pulsed with the relentless energy of a city built on dreams and broken hearts. On Broadway, where neon signs promised fame and fortune to anyone with a guitar and a story to tell, street musicians competed for the attention of tourists who walked from honky-tonk to honky-tonk, their pockets full of tip money and their heads full of whiskey and possibility. It was here, among the dreamers and the desperate, that Marcus Thompson had found his place in the world, not as the recording artist he had once hoped to become, but as a purveyor of musical memories for strangers who would forget his face but remember his songs. Marcus had arrived in Nashville 7 years earlier, with nothing but a battered acoustic guitar, a duffel bag full of clothes, and a notebook filled with original compositions that he believed would revolutionize country music. He had been 23 then, fresh from a small town in Kentucky, where his talent had made him a local celebrity, where his high school music teacher had convinced him that Nashville was waiting for someone exactly like him. The reality of Music City had proven far more brutal than his small-town imagination had prepared him for. Demo recordings had been ignored, meetings with producers had never materialized, and the songs he had crafted with such care had been dismissed as derivative or unmarketable by industry professionals who heard hundreds of similar compositions every week. By 2012, Marcus had accepted that his dreams of musical stardom were probably not going to materialize, but he had also discovered that he possessed a different kind of gift, an almost supernatural ability to remember and recreate songs from memory. He could hear a melody once and play it back perfectly, could identify the key and chord progressions of songs he had never studied, could improvise harmonies and arrangements that transformed familiar tunes into something fresh and compelling. This gift had made him one of the most successful buskers on Broadway, earning enough money to support himself while maintaining the illusion that he was still pursuing his musical dreams. Marcus had developed a reputation among Nashville's street musician community as someone who could play any request, no matter how obscure or unusual. Tourists would approach his corner at 2nd Avenue and Broadway with challenges. Half-remembered lullabies from childhood, ethnic folk songs learned from immigrant grandparents, regional ballads that had never achieved national recognition. Marcus would listen intently, asking them to hum a few bars or describe the rhythm, and then he would reproduce their requested song with startling accuracy, often adding embellishments and flourishes that made their familiar melody sound new and wonderful. This particular gift had earned Marcus a steady following of regular listeners who would seek him out specifically, knowing that he could provide musical experiences that no other performer in Nashville could offer. He had developed an extensive repertoire that included not just country and pop standards, but also folk songs from dozens of ethnic traditions, children's lullabies in languages he didn't speak, and regional ballads that existed nowhere except in the memories of the people who had learned them from their families. On the afternoon of July 18, 2018, Marcus was performing his usual Wednesday afternoon set at his regular corner when he noticed a young girl standing at the edge of the small crowd that had gathered to listen. She appeared to be around 11 years old, with straight black hair and delicate Asian features, wearing a faded pink t-shirt and jeans that looked like they had been purchased from a thrift store. What caught Marcus's attention was not her appearance but her behavior. She was humming along with his performance of Amazing Grace, her voice barely audible but perfectly in tune, harmonizing with his melody in a way that suggested formal musical training or natural talent. The girl remained at the edge of the crowd for nearly an hour, humming along with every song Marcus performed, but never approaching to make a request or drop money in his guitar case. When he took a break to tune his guitar and drink some water, she continued to hum. But now she was humming something Marcus had never heard before, a simple but hauntingly beautiful melody that seemed to combine Western musical traditions with something that sounded distinctly Asian, possibly Chinese. Marcus found himself captivated by the melody the girl was humming. It was unlike anything in his extensive repertoire, simultaneously familiar and foreign, with a structure that suggested it was probably a traditional song rather than something contemporary. The tune seemed to tell a story even without words, building from a simple opening phrase through increasingly complex variations, before returning to the original theme with subtle modifications that made it feel both complete and cyclical. "That's a beautiful song," Marcus said during his break, addressing the girl directly. "Where did you learn it?" The girl looked startled, as if she hadn't realized she was humming loud enough to be heard. She glanced around nervously, then shrugged and said, "I don't remember, I just know it." Her voice carried a slight accent that Marcus couldn't identify, and her eyes had the wary quality of someone who had learned not to trust adults too quickly. "Could you hum it again?" Marcus asked. "I'd like to learn it." The girl hesitated, then began to hum the melody again, more softly this time, but still clearly enough for Marcus to follow along. As she hummed, Marcus found himself picking out the notes on his guitar, identifying the key and chord progressions, translating the simple melody into something that could be accompanied and expanded. The song was in a minor key with modal inflections that gave it an ancient, timeless quality, and the more Marcus heard it, the more convinced he became that it was probably a traditional lullaby or folk song from China or another East Asian country. "That's really lovely," Marcus said when the girl finished humming. "What's your name?" "Emma," the girl replied, though something in her expression suggested that she had hesitated before providing that answer, as if she had to think about what name she should give. "Are you here with your family, Emma?" Marcus asked, looking around for adults who might be responsible for the child. "My mom's working," Emma said vaguely, gesturing in the direction of the tourist shops that lined Broadway. "She said I could listen to music while she finishes up." Marcus nodded, accepting this explanation, though something about the girl's demeanor continued to seem unusual. She had the self-possessed quality of a child who had grown up quickly, who had learned to navigate the world independently, but there was also something almost fragile about her, as if she was carefully maintaining a performance that required constant attention. For the next hour, Marcus incorporated the melody Emma had taught him into his busking set, using it as a bridge between more familiar songs or as a gentle interlude when he needed to rest his voice. The melody worked beautifully with guitar accompaniment, and several tourists commented on how lovely and unusual it sounded. Emma remained at the edge of the crowd, sometimes humming along, sometimes just listening, but always watching Marcus with an intensity that suggested the song held special significance for her. As the afternoon grew later and the crowd began to thin, Marcus noticed that Emma seemed increasingly anxious, checking a small digital watch on her wrist and looking in the direction she had indicated her mother was working. When she finally announced that she had to leave, Marcus felt an unexpected sense of loss, as if he was saying goodbye to someone he had known much longer than a few hours. "Will you be back tomorrow?" Marcus asked, as Emma prepared to leave. "Maybe," Emma replied, but her tone suggested uncertainty rather than evasion. "It depends on where we go next." As Emma disappeared into the crowd of tourists walking down Broadway, Marcus found himself continuing to play the melody she had taught him, trying to capture every nuance and variation he had heard in her humming. The song seemed to contain layers of meaning that he couldn't quite access, emotional depth that suggested it was more than just a simple children's lullaby. There was something about the way Emma had hummed it, with reverence and familiarity but also with sadness, that made Marcus believe the song was connected to memories that were both precious and painful. That evening, Marcus researched Chinese lullabies and traditional folk songs online, trying to identify the melody Emma had shared with him. He found dozens of similar songs, traditional melodies that parents and grandparents sang to children, but nothing that matched exactly what he had heard. The song seemed to exist in the space between traditional and contemporary, recognizable as part of a cultural tradition, but unique in its specific construction and emotional resonance. Detective Mark Rodriguez had learned to approach cold cases with a mixture of professional skepticism and desperate hope. After 13 years with the Cedar Falls Police Department, he had seen enough missing person investigations to understand that most cases were resolved within the first 48 hours, or they weren't resolved at all. Sarah Chen Morrison's file had been on his desk for 3 years, growing thicker with false leads and dead ends, but no closer to any kind of resolution that would bring peace to her family or justice for whatever had happened to her. The call came on a Thursday morning in late July 2018, transferred to Rodriguez from the Nashville Metro Police Department by a dispatcher who admitted she wasn't entirely sure the tip warranted interstate attention. The caller, a street musician named Marcus Thompson, claimed he had encountered a child who matched the description of Sarah Chen Morrison and who had demonstrated knowledge of a specific song that might be connected to the case. Rodriguez had received dozens of similar calls over the years, well-meaning citizens who believed they had spotted Sarah in shopping malls, at bus stations in other cities, but something about this particular tip struck him as different, more detailed and specific than the usual reports. "She's the right age," Marcus explained during their initial phone conversation, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone who understood he might be making an extraordinary claim. Asian features, about 11 years old now, and she was humming this melody that sounded like it might be Chinese or maybe another Asian traditional song. "I've never heard anything like it before, but it was beautiful and complex, like something that had been passed down through generations." Rodriguez found himself taking notes more carefully than usual, partly because Marcus seemed unusually thoughtful and observant for a typical tipster, but mostly because of the detail about the song. Sarah's grandmother, Mei Chen, had mentioned during the original investigation that she had taught Sarah several traditional Chinese lullabies, including one specific melody about paper boats that Sarah had particularly loved. The detail had been noted in the case file, but had never seemed particularly relevant to the investigation, until now. "Can you describe the melody?" Rodriguez asked. "Could you hum it or play it over the phone?" Marcus attempted to reproduce the melody using his guitar, playing it slowly and clearly through the phone connection. Rodriguez found himself unable to identify the tune, but something about its structure and emotional tone reminded him of the recordings Mei Chen had made for investigators 8 years earlier, traditional songs sung in Mandarin that Sarah had been learning before her disappearance. "I'm going to need you to make a formal statement," Rodriguez told Marcus, "and I'd like to get a recording of that melody if possible. Can you tell me exactly where and when you encountered this child?" Marcus provided detailed information about his interaction with the girl who had called herself Emma, including physical descriptions, behavioral observations, and the approximate time and location of their encounter. He also mentioned that the girl had seemed somewhat evasive about her circumstances, claiming her mother was working nearby, but providing vague details about their living situation and future plans. Rodriguez immediately contacted the Nashville Metro Police Department to request their assistance in locating the girl Marcus had described. He also reached out to David Morrison and Mei Chen, asking them to listen to a recording of the melody Marcus had learned and to provide their assessment of whether it matched any of the songs Sarah had known before her disappearance. The response from Sarah's family was immediate and profound. David Morrison broke down crying when he heard Marcus play the melody over the phone, recognizing it instantly as the lullaby his mother-in-law had taught Sarah, the same song Sarah had been humming in the backyard on the morning she disappeared. Mei Chen confirmed that the melody was indeed a traditional Chinese lullaby about paper boats floating down rivers toward home, a song she had taught Sarah using both Mandarin and English lyrics, and one that very few people outside their family would have known. "That's Sarah's song," Mei Chen told Rodriguez through tears during their phone conversation. "I taught it to her myself, and she loved it so much. She used to sing it every day, sometimes in Chinese, sometimes making up her own English words. If someone else knows that song exactly the way Sarah learned it, then they learned it from Sarah." The Nashville Metro Police Department launched an immediate search for the girl Marcus had encountered, focusing on the Broadway Entertainment District and the surrounding areas where transient populations might be staying. They interviewed other street performers, business owners, and hotel clerks, showing them enhanced age progression photographs of Sarah Chen Morrison and asking whether they had seen a child matching her description. Meanwhile, Rodriguez began the process of coordinating with federal authorities to treat the Nashville sighting as a credible lead in an active kidnapping investigation. The FBI's child abduction rapid deployment team was notified, and agents began traveling to Nashville to take over the search efforts. Media outlets were contacted to prepare Amber Alert notifications, though authorities decided to withhold public announcements until they had more concrete evidence that the girl Marcus had encountered was actually Sarah. Marcus Thompson found himself at the center of an investigation unlike anything he had ever experienced. FBI agents interviewed him extensively, asking him to recreate his interaction with the girl in minute detail, to describe every aspect of her appearance and behavior, to play the melody she had taught him dozens of times until agents were satisfied they had accurate recordings. He was asked to work with a police sketch artist to create composite drawings of the girl, and to review hundreds of photographs of missing children to confirm that his encounter matched Sarah Chen Morrison's case specifically. The search efforts in Nashville intensified over the following days, with teams of investigators canvassing hotels, shelters, and temporary housing facilities throughout the metropolitan area. They interviewed employers who might hire undocumented workers, checked with social service agencies that provided assistance to transient families, and monitored bus stations and airports for signs of a woman traveling with a child matching Emma's description. But as the days passed without any additional sightings or concrete leads, Rodriguez began to experience the familiar frustration of a promising tip that led nowhere. Nashville was a city of more than 600,000 people, with thousands of tourists and temporary residents who came and went without leaving traces that could be followed by investigators. If Sarah Chen Morrison was actually in Nashville, she was being kept by someone who understood how to remain invisible in an urban environment. Marcus continued his regular busking schedule on Broadway, hoping that Emma might return to hear him play again, but she never reappeared. He found himself scanning every crowd for her face, listening for the sound of her humming, playing her lullaby during every performance in case she was somewhere nearby and might be drawn to the familiar melody. The song had become an obsession for him, not just because of its connection to the missing child case, but because of its inherent beauty and emotional resonance. Rodriguez made several trips to Nashville to coordinate the search efforts and to interview Marcus Thompson in person. He found the street musician to be credible and observant, clearly affected by the possibility that he had encountered a missing child, but not seeking attention or financial reward for his tip. Marcus had refused all media interviews and had asked that his name be withheld from public reports about the investigation, concerned that publicity might drive Emma's captors to relocate her again. 3 weeks after Marcus's initial report, the active search efforts in Nashville were scaled back, though the case remained a high priority for both local and federal investigators. Rodriguez returned to Cedar Falls with recordings of Sarah's lullaby and a renewed sense of hope that his cold case might actually be solvable, but also with the frustrating knowledge that hope and evidence were not the same thing. The melody Marcus had learned from Emma became a crucial piece of evidence in the Sarah Chen Morrison case, but it was also a reminder of how much they still didn't know. If Sarah was alive and living under a different identity, who had taken her? How had they managed to disappear so completely from Cedar Falls? Why had they allowed her to retain knowledge of the song that connected her to her original identity? And most importantly, where was she now? The revelation that Sarah Chen Morrison might still be alive after 8 years sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and beyond. Within hours of Detective Rodriguez confirming the authenticity of the lullaby Marcus Thompson had recorded, the FBI had elevated Sarah's case to active status and deployed a full investigative team to Nashville. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children issued new age progression photographs showing what Sarah might look like at age 11, and her story was featured on every major news network in the country. Linda Morrison received the call at her office in Waterloo on a Friday afternoon in early August. She had been reviewing a particularly complex immigration document when her phone rang, displaying the familiar number of the Cedar Falls Police Department. Over the years, she had learned to steel herself for these calls, which usually brought news of another false sighting or the discovery of remains that would ultimately prove to belong to someone else's child. But Detective Rodriguez's voice carried an urgency she hadn't heard since the first weeks of Sarah's disappearance. "Linda, I need you to sit down," Rodriguez said. "We may have found Sarah." The words hit Linda like a physical blow. 8 years of carefully constructed emotional armor crumbling in an instant. She found herself unable to speak, unable to breathe, unable to process the possibility that the nightmare that had defined her adult life might finally be ending. When she was finally able to respond, her voice came out as a whisper. "Are you sure?" Rodriguez explained the situation carefully, emphasizing that they had not yet located Sarah, but that they had credible evidence she was alive and had been in Nashville as recently as 3 weeks earlier. He described Marcus Thompson's encounter with the girl who called herself Emma, the significance of the lullaby she had hummed, and the ongoing search efforts that were now focused on finding a woman traveling with a child of Sarah's age and description. Linda Morrison's world shifted fundamentally in that moment. For 8 years, she had lived with the terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether her daughter was alive or dead, whether she was suffering or had found peace, whether she remembered her family or had forgotten them entirely. The possibility that Sarah was alive meant hope, but it also meant confronting the reality that her daughter had been living somewhere else, with someone else, for most of her childhood. The 3-year-old who had disappeared from their backyard had become an 11-year-old stranger, shaped by experiences Linda could not imagine. David Morrison's reaction was more volatile. When Rodriguez called him with the news, David immediately began making plans to travel to Nashville, convinced that he could succeed where professional investigators had failed. His obsessive study of Sarah's case over the years had given him encyclopedic knowledge of every detail, every lead, every theory that had been investigated. He believed that his emotional connection to Sarah would allow him to recognize her even if she had been trained to avoid her biological family. "I know her better than anyone," David told Rodriguez during a heated phone conversation. "I know how she moves, how she thinks, how she reacts to music. If she's in Nashville, I can find her." Rodriguez gently but firmly explained that David's presence in Nashville could potentially compromise the investigation. If Sarah was being held by someone who had successfully kept her hidden for 8 years, the sudden appearance of her biological father might cause them to relocate again, potentially ending their best chance of recovering her safely. The FBI had protocols for these situations that prioritized the child's safety over the family's emotional needs, and those protocols required that David and Linda remain in Iowa while the professionals conducted the search. Meanwhile, in Nashville, Marcus Thompson had become an unofficial consultant to the FBI investigation. Agents had asked him to maintain his regular busking schedule and to continue playing Sarah's lullaby during his performances, hoping that she might hear the familiar melody and be drawn back to his corner on Broadway. They had also equipped him with a small recording device and instructed him to document any interactions with children who seemed to recognize the song or who displayed unusual interest in his performances. The media attention surrounding Sarah's case had transformed Nashville's Broadway district into something resembling a crime scene. News crews from across the country had descended on the area where Marcus performed, interviewing tourists and local residents, broadcasting live reports from the street corner where Sarah had supposedly been spotted. The increased attention made Marcus's regular performances nearly impossible, as crowds of reporters and curiosity seekers overwhelmed the normal flow of tourists and music lovers who typically comprised his audience. FBI agents had also begun working with child psychologists and trauma specialists to prepare for the possibility that they might successfully locate Sarah. After 8 years of living under an assumed identity, possibly with captors who had convinced her that her biological family was dead or dangerous, Sarah might not react positively to being rescued. The psychological profile suggested that she might have formed emotional attachments to her captors, might view law enforcement as a threat rather than salvation, and might actively resist efforts to return her to Cedar Falls. The investigation had expanded beyond Nashville to include surrounding cities and rural areas throughout Tennessee, Kentucky, and Alabama. Law enforcement agencies coordinated their efforts through the FBI's field office in Memphis, sharing information about transient populations, undocumented workers, and families living off the grid. The profile of Sarah's potential captors had evolved to include the possibility that they were part of a larger network involved in human trafficking or illegal adoption, organizations sophisticated enough to maintain false identities for extended periods. Mei Chen had traveled from Cedar Falls to Nashville against the advice of law enforcement, determined to be present if her granddaughter was found. At 78 years old, she had endured 8 years of wondering whether she would die before learning Sarah's fate, and the possibility of resolution had given her a strength that surprised everyone who knew her. She had checked into a small hotel near Broadway and spent her days walking the streets, humming the lullaby she had taught Sarah, hoping that somehow her voice might reach across the years and the distance to call her granddaughter home. "I taught her that song when she was barely 2 years old," Mei Chen explained to FBI agent Sarah Collins during one of their daily briefings. "She would sit on my lap and try to follow along with the Chinese words, but she always remembered the melody perfectly. Music lives in the heart longer than words live in the mind. If she is out there, if she remembers anything at all, she remembers that song." The search efforts had also revealed the disturbing scope of child trafficking in the American South. FBI databases contained thousands of reports of missing children, many from families who lacked the resources or immigration status to mount extensive search efforts. Sarah's case had received national attention, partly because her family had been able to advocate for her. But investigators were discovering that she was likely one of many children who had disappeared into underground networks that specialized in placing kidnapped children with families willing to pay for the illusion of legal adoption. Marcus Thompson had become increasingly isolated as the investigation continued. The media attention had made his regular busking impossible, and he had been forced to find other locations throughout Nashville to continue earning money while remaining available to assist law enforcement. He had also begun experiencing what he could only describe as obsession with Sarah's lullaby, finding himself playing it constantly, hearing it in his dreams, unable to shake the melody from his mind even when he tried to focus on other music. "I keep thinking about her eyes," Marcus told Agent Collins during one of their regular interviews. "There was something in the way she looked at me when she was humming that song, like she was trying to tell me something important, but didn't know how to say it. She seemed so careful, so controlled for a kid that age, like she had learned to be invisible." The psychological evaluation of Marcus's encounter had revealed several details that supported the theory that Emma was indeed Sarah Chen Morrison. The girl had demonstrated perfect pitch and musical memory, traits that were consistent with Sarah's early musical development. She had also shown signs of what psychologists termed hypervigilance, constantly scanning her environment and maintaining emotional distance from adults, behaviors consistent with children who had been coached to avoid detection by authorities. Law enforcement had also begun investigating the possibility that Sarah's captors were still in the Nashville area, potentially monitoring the search efforts and preparing to relocate again. The FBI had established surveillance at bus stations, airports, and major highways leading out of the city, looking for women traveling with children who match Sarah's description. They had also worked with media outlets to limit coverage of specific investigative techniques, hoping to prevent Sarah's captors from learning details that might help them evade capture. The strain of the investigation was taking its toll on everyone involved. David Morrison had violated Rodriguez's instructions and driven to Nashville, where he spent his days walking Broadway and the surrounding streets, showing Sarah's age progression photograph to anyone who would look at it. His presence complicated the FBI's efforts, as his obvious desperation and emotional volatility made him conspicuous to potential witnesses who might otherwise cooperate with more discreet investigators. Linda Morrison had taken leave from her job and was staying with friends in Cedar Falls, unable to concentrate on anything except the hourly updates from Nashville. She had begun experiencing what her doctor described as delayed trauma response, as the possibility of Sarah's recovery forced her to confront emotions she had suppressed for 8 years. The prospect of reuniting with her daughter was simultaneously the fulfillment of her deepest hope and a terrifying reminder of how much they had both changed during their years apart. 3 weeks into the expanded search, investigators received a breakthrough that seemed to confirm their theory about Sarah's identity. A social worker in Clarksville, Tennessee, about 60 miles northwest of Nashville, reported that she had encountered a girl matching Sarah's description during a routine visit to a family suspected of housing undocumented workers. The girl had been present during the social worker's visit, but had remained silent and appeared coached to avoid interaction with authorities. The Clarksville lead required careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. The family in question, identified as Manuel and Rosa Gutierrez, had been under investigation for immigration violations, but had not been connected to any missing children cases. Surveillance of their property revealed the presence of several adults and at least 2 children, including a girl who appeared to match the age and physical description of both Sarah Chen Morrison and the Emma that Marcus Thompson had encountered. FBI agents established a command post in Clarksville and began planning a coordinated operation to approach the Gutierrez property. The challenges were significant. They needed to confirm the girl's identity without alerting potential captors, ensure the safety of all children on the property, and preserve evidence that might lead to the broader network responsible for Sarah's disappearance. The operation would require the cooperation of federal immigration authorities, local law enforcement, and child protection services. As preparations for the Clarksville operation continued, Marcus Thompson received permission to travel from Nashville to assist with the identification process. His ability to recognize the girl who had taught him Sarah's lullaby might be crucial in confirming her identity before approaching the family directly. The FBI had also arranged for May Chen to be present during the operation, believing that Sarah might respond more positively to her grandmother's voice than to law enforcement officers. The operation was scheduled for dawn on August 23, 2018, exactly 8 years and 10 months after Sarah Chen Morrison had vanished from her backyard in Cedar Falls, Iowa. After years of dead ends and false hopes, law enforcement officials were cautiously optimistic that they were finally closing in on one of the most challenging missing child cases in recent memory. Dawn came early to Clarksville, Tennessee, on August 23, 2018, painting the horizon in shades of rose and gold that reminded May Chen of the mornings she used to spend in her garden, teaching her granddaughter the names of flowers in both English and Mandarin. Now 8 years and 10 months after Sarah's disappearance, Mei Chen sat in the back of an FBI surveillance van, clutching a small photograph of her granddaughter and humming the lullaby that had brought them to this moment. The Gutierrez property sat on a dead-end road outside Clarksville, a modest ranch house surrounded by overgrown fields and a collection of outbuildings that suggested the family engaged in some form of agricultural work. FBI surveillance had confirmed the presence of at least 8 adults and 3 children on the property, including the girl who matched Sarah's description. The operation had been planned with military precision, involving agents from 3 field offices, local law enforcement, child protection services, and immigration authorities. Agent Sarah Collins reviewed the operation one final time with the assembled team. The primary objective was to safely extract the children from the property and confirm their identities, particularly the girl believed to be Sarah Chen Morrison. Secondary objectives included gathering evidence about the broader network that might be responsible for child trafficking and documenting any immigration violations that could be used to pressure the adults for information about Sarah's captors. Marcus Thompson waited in a separate vehicle, armed with a high-quality recording of the lullaby he had learned from Emma, and prepared to attempt positive identification if the girl was brought out safely. He had spent sleepless nights rehearsing this moment, imagining different scenarios for how Sarah might react to seeing him again, wondering whether she would remember their brief interaction in Nashville, or whether she had been coached to forget such encounters. At exactly 6 a.m., FBI agents approached the Gutierrez house from multiple directions, executing search warrants and immigration holds simultaneously. The operation was designed to prevent anyone from fleeing or destroying evidence, but also to minimize trauma for the children who might not understand what was happening or why armed officers were surrounding their home. The initial entry proceeded without incident. Manuel and Rosa Gutierrez offered no resistance and appeared to have been expecting this type of law enforcement action, though they claimed no knowledge of any missing children or illegal activities beyond their own immigration status. The adults on the property included several individuals whose identities could not be immediately verified, and all were detained for questioning while agents searched for the children. The 3 children found on the property were brought out individually, accompanied by child protection specialists trained in trauma response. The first 2 were boys, ages approximately 6 and 9, who appeared frightened but physically unharmed. The third child was a girl who matched the general description of Sarah Chen Morrison, but who seemed older and more mature than the 11-year-old investigators had expected to find. Agent Collins approached the girl carefully, speaking in gentle tones and avoiding any sudden movements that might increase her obvious anxiety. The child had straight black hair and delicate Asian features, stood approximately 4 feet 8 inches tall, and appeared to be in good physical health despite wearing clothes that looked like they had been purchased at thrift stores. Most importantly, she demonstrated the hyper-vigilant behavior that psychologists had predicted Sarah might exhibit after years of hiding her true identity. "Hi there," Agent Collins said, kneeling to bring herself to the child's eye level. "My name is Sarah, and I'm with the FBI. We're here to help you and you're not in any trouble. Can you tell me your name?" The girl hesitated for several seconds before responding, "Emma Rodriguez." Her voice carried the slight accent that Marcus Thompson had described, and her eyes darted constantly between the FBI agents and the house where the adults were being questioned. "Emma, we'd like to ask you a few questions, and we have someone here who thinks he might know you. Would that be okay?" The girl nodded slowly, though her posture remained tense and ready for flight. Agent Collins signaled to Marcus Thompson, who approached carrying his guitar and the recording device containing Sarah's lullaby. Marcus felt his heart racing as he got his first clear look at the girl who might be Sarah Chen Morrison. She was definitely the same child he had encountered in Nashville, but seeing her in these circumstances made him acutely aware of how young and vulnerable she appeared. Her eyes held a wariness that no 11-year-old should possess, and her careful composure suggested years of training in how to interact with adults who might pose a threat. "Hi, Emma," Marcus said softly. "I think we met a few weeks ago in Nashville. You taught me a beautiful song and I've been playing it ever since. Would you like to hear it?" The girl's expression changed slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing her features before she resumed her careful neutrality. Marcus began to play the lullaby slowly and clearly, watching for any reaction that might confirm her identity. As the melody filled the morning air, the girl's composure finally cracked. Her eyes filled with tears, and she began to hum along with the music, her voice carrying the same haunting quality that had captivated Marcus during their encounter in Nashville. The song seemed to unlock something in her memory, and for the first time since the operation began, she looked like a child rather than a small adult trained to be invisible. Agent Collins signaled to Mei Chen, who had been waiting in the surveillance van for this moment. Sarah's grandmother approached slowly, her own eyes filled with tears as she heard her granddaughter's voice carrying the melody she had taught her 8 years earlier. "Sarah," Mei Chen whispered in Mandarin, using the Chinese name she had given her granddaughter. "Little boat, you have come home." The girl looked up sharply at the sound of her grandmother's voice, her careful composure dissolving entirely. She stared at Mei Chen for several long seconds, as if trying to reconcile the elderly woman before her with memories that had been suppressed for years. "Nai Nai," she whispered, using the Mandarin word for grandmother that Mei Chen had taught her as a toddler. The reunion between Sarah Chen Morrison and her grandmother was both heartbreaking and beautiful. 8 years of separation, 8 years of wondering and hoping and grieving, collapsed into a single moment of recognition and love. Mei Chen gathered her granddaughter into her arms, speaking to her in rapid Mandarin, while Sarah responded in halting phrases that suggested she had retained more of the language than anyone had expected. But even as the family celebrated this miraculous reunion, the investigation into Sarah's disappearance was far from over. The adults detained at the Gutierrez property claimed no knowledge of how Sarah had come to be living with them, insisting that they had been told she was the daughter of undocumented relatives who had been unable to care for her. The story was plausible, but vague, lacking the specific details that would allow investigators to trace Sarah's movements over the past 8 years. Sarah herself was unable to provide clear information about her captors or the circumstances of her disappearance. Medical and psychological evaluations revealed that she had been well cared for physically, but showed signs of what specialists termed coached amnesia, selective memory loss that appeared to be the result of systematic conditioning rather than natural trauma response. She remembered fragments of her early childhood in Cedar Falls, particularly the time she spent with her grandmother, but claimed no memory of how she had left Iowa or who had brought her to Tennessee. The investigation would continue for months, eventually revealing a network of individuals involved in placing kidnapped children with families who wanted to adopt but were unable to navigate legal channels. Sarah's case had been particularly challenging because her mixed ethnic heritage made her valuable to clients seeking Asian children, and her young age at the time of her disappearance had made it easier to establish a false identity that could withstand casual scrutiny. But for now, in the golden light of a Tennessee morning, none of that mattered. Sarah Chen Morrison was alive, she was safe, and she was going home. The melody that had connected her to her past had finally led her back to the family who had never stopped believing she would return. As Marcus Thompson played the lullaby one more time, Sarah hummed along with the confidence of someone who had never really forgotten the song, even when she had been forced to forget everything else. The paper boats in her grandmother's lullaby had finally found their way down the river toward home. The journey back to Cedar Falls was both a homecoming and an introduction to a life that Sarah could barely remember. FBI agents had arranged for a private flight from Nashville to Waterloo, Iowa, allowing the family to avoid the media circus that had engulfed the story of Sarah's recovery. During the 2-hour flight, Sarah sat between her grandmother and Agent Collins, clutching the small teddy bear that May Chen had carried for 8 years, in hopes of this exact moment. Linda Morrison waited at the Waterloo airport with an anxiety that was almost unbearable. The daughter she had lost as a 3-year-old was returning as an 11-year-old stranger, shaped by experiences Linda could not imagine and memories that had been deliberately obscured. The FBI had prepared her for the possibility that Sarah might not remember her at all, might view her as another adult to be wary of, might struggle with the transition from the only life she had known for the past 8 years to a family that existed mostly in fragments of suppressed memory. The reunion between Sarah and her mother was quieter and more tentative than the emotional embrace she had shared with her grandmother. Linda approached her daughter with tears streaming down her face, but Sarah's response was polite rather than joyful, as if she was meeting a kind stranger rather than reconnecting with her mother. The years of separation had created a gulf that would require time and patience to bridge. "Hi, Sarah," Linda said softly, kneeling to bring herself to her daughter's eye level. "I'm your mom. I've missed you so much." Sarah studied her mother's face with the careful attention she had learned to apply to all new situations, looking for clues about how she should respond. "Hi," she replied in a small voice. "Agent Collins says you've been looking for me for a long time." The drive from Waterloo to Cedar Falls passed through landscapes that might have triggered memories for Sarah, but she showed no recognition of the Iowa countryside that had been her first home. She sat quietly in the back seat of Linda's car, occasionally asking practical questions about where she would sleep and what she would eat, but showing none of the excitement or curiosity that might be expected from a child returning to her family after years of separation. The house on Maple Street had been prepared for Sarah's return with obsessive care. David Morrison had spent the week before her recovery cleaning and organizing every room, ensuring that Sarah's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it 8 years earlier, while also making adjustments for the needs of an 11-year-old rather than a 3-year-old. The swing set in the backyard had been restored to perfect condition, its chains oiled and its wooden seats refinished to remove the wear of 8 Iowa winters. But when Sarah first entered the house, she showed no signs of recognition or emotional connection to the space that had been preserved as a shrine to her childhood. She examined her old bedroom with polite interest, commenting on the toys and books that had been waiting for her return, but treating them as artifacts from someone else's life, rather than treasures from her own past. The disconnect was heartbreaking for her family, who had hoped that familiar surroundings might unlock the memories that had been suppressed for so many years. Dr. Patricia Huang, a child psychologist specializing in recovered abduction cases, had been brought in to help Sarah and her family navigate the complex process of reunification. She explained to Linda and David that Sarah's apparent lack of emotional connection to her original home was not unusual for children who had been successfully integrated into false identities for extended periods. "Sarah has spent 8 years learning to be Emma Rodriguez," Dr. Huang explained during a family meeting on Sarah's second day home. That identity kept her safe, but it also required her to suppress memories and emotional connections that might have given away her true origins. The process of recovering those memories and rebuilding emotional bonds with her biological family will take time, and it may never be complete. The media attention surrounding Sarah's recovery had transformed Cedar Falls into a temporary circus of news crews and curiosity seekers, all hoping for glimpses of the girl whose story had captivated the nation. The Morrison family had been forced to install security systems and hire private guards to protect their privacy during Sarah's transition period. The irony was not lost on Linda that after 8 years of praying for attention that might help find her daughter, she now desperately wanted the attention to disappear so that Sarah could adjust to her new life in peace. Sarah's first weeks in Cedar Falls were marked by careful politeness and emotional distance that was more difficult for her family to navigate than outright hostility might have been. She followed the household routines that were established for her, ate the meals that were prepared, and participated in the activities that were suggested, but she did so with the compliant detachment of someone fulfilling obligations rather than engaging with loved ones. The one consistent exception was her relationship with her grandmother. Mei Chen's presence seemed to unlock something in Sarah that remained hidden from her parents, and the two of them would spend hours together speaking in Mandarin and sharing memories that predated Sarah's disappearance. It was during these conversations that Sarah began to display genuine emotion, laughing at stories Mei Chen told about their time together and asking questions about relatives and traditions she was beginning to remember. "She remembers more than she's telling us," Mei Chen confided to Linda during one of their evening conversations. "In Chinese, she talks about the garden we used to tend together, about the dumplings we made for New Year, about the songs I taught her. The memories are there, but they're trapped behind walls that she built to protect herself." Marcus Thompson had maintained contact with the Morrison family throughout Sarah's recovery, calling regularly to check on her progress and occasionally visiting Cedar Falls to play music with her. Sarah's response to Marcus was warmer than her interactions with most adults, perhaps because their relationship had been established during her time as Emma rather than being connected to memories she had been conditioned to suppress. During one of Marcus's visits, Sarah asked him to teach her guitar chords so that she could accompany herself while singing the lullaby that had led to her recovery. The music seemed to serve as a bridge between her two identities, allowing her to access emotions and memories that remained locked away during other activities. "When I sing Nai-Nai's song, I remember things," Sarah told Marcus during one of their music sessions. "I remember sitting in the garden and helping her water the vegetables. I remember the way the house smelled when she was cooking. But when I try to remember other things, it's like there's a wall in my mind that I can't see over." The investigation into Sarah's disappearance and captivity continued throughout her transition period, with FBI agents regularly interviewing her about her memories of the past 8 years. The interviews were conducted carefully, with Dr. Huang present to ensure that the questioning did not re-traumatize Sarah or interfere with her recovery process. Gradually, fragments of Sarah's story began to emerge. She remembered being taken from the backyard by a woman who claimed to be a friend of her mother's, someone who said that Linda had been hurt and that Sarah needed to come quickly to help her. The woman had driven Sarah to a house where she was told her mother was recovering, but Linda was not there, and Sarah was informed that her family had been in an accident and that she would need to stay with new people who would take care of her. The conditioning that followed had been systematic and professional. Sarah had been given a new name and a new history, taught to respond to Emma Rodriguez rather than Sarah Chen Morrison, and gradually convinced that her memories of Cedar Falls were dreams or fantasies rather than recollections of her real life. The process had been so thorough that by the time she was placed with the Gutierrez family in Tennessee, she genuinely believed that Emma Rodriguez was her true identity and that any contradictory memories were products of her imagination. 3 months after her recovery, Sarah began attending Cedar Falls Middle School. Enrolled in 6th grade under her original name, but with support systems in place to help her navigate the social and academic challenges of returning to a normal childhood after years of living off the grid. Her teachers had been briefed on her situation and instructed to watch for signs of distress or confusion that might indicate she was struggling with her transition. The other students at school knew who Sarah was. Her story had been national news, and Cedar Falls was too small a community for her return to remain secret, but most of them treated her with the mixture of curiosity and kindness that characterized their small-town upbringing. Sarah found herself making friends gradually, though she remained more reserved and cautious than typical children her age. As autumn arrived in Cedar Falls, bringing with it the annual Hope Walk that had been held every October 15th since Sarah's disappearance, the community faced the question of how to acknowledge her return while respecting her family's need for privacy. The decision was made to transform the memorial walk into a celebration of hope fulfilled, with Sarah participating if she felt comfortable doing so. On October 15, 2018, exactly 8 years after her disappearance, Sarah Chen Morrison stood with her family at the starting point of the Hope Walk, surrounded by hundreds of community members who had never stopped believing she would come home. She was still a work in progress, still rebuilding connections to a life she could only partially remember, but she was alive, she was safe, and she was home. As the walk began, Sarah found herself humming the lullaby that had brought her back to Cedar Falls, her voice joining with her grandmother's in a melody that had survived 8 years of separation and conditioning. The paper boats in the song had finally completed their journey down the river, carrying not just a lost child, but an entire community's faith in the possibility that love could overcome even the most impossible circumstances. 2 years had passed since Sarah Chen Morrison's return to Cedar Falls, and the seasons had settled into a new rhythm that included her presence in ways both profound and mundane. The girl who had once been Emma Rodriguez had grown into a 13-year-old who could navigate between her recovered identity and her emerging sense of self with a grace that surprised everyone who knew her story. She was no longer the polite stranger who had returned from Tennessee, but she was also not quite the same child who had disappeared from the backyard 8 years earlier. Instead, she had become someone entirely new, a bridge between past and present, memory and possibility. The transformation had not been linear or simple. There had been setbacks and breakthroughs, moments of recognition followed by periods of confusion, gradual rebuilding of relationships that had been severed by time and trauma. Dr. Huang had warned the family that recovery from prolonged captivity was not a destination but a process, one that would continue for years and might never result in complete restoration of Sarah's original identity. Sarah's relationship with her mother had evolved slowly from polite distance to genuine affection, though it remained different from the bond she shared with her grandmother. Linda Morrison had learned to appreciate the daughter who had returned to her, rather than mourning the child who had been lost, accepting that Sarah's experiences during her missing years had shaped her in ways that could not be undone. They had developed new traditions together, weekly trips to the Cedar Falls Library, cooking lessons that honored both American and Chinese culinary traditions, evening walks through the neighborhood where Sarah was learning to feel safe again. David Morrison had struggled more with Sarah's return than anyone had anticipated. His obsessive focus on finding her had given his life purpose for 8 years, and her recovery had forced him to confront the reality that the investigation phase of their ordeal was over, but the healing phase might prove even more challenging. He had sold the house on Maple Street 6 months after Sarah's return, unable to reconcile the shrine he had maintained with the needs of the living child who had come home. The family now lived in a smaller house across town, one chosen for its proximity to the school and its lack of association with either Sarah's disappearance or her parents' divorce. The criminal investigation into Sarah's disappearance had resulted in federal charges against 12 individuals involved in what prosecutors described as one of the most sophisticated child trafficking networks ever uncovered in the American South. The woman who had initially taken Sarah from the backyard, identified as Rebecca Martinez, had been arrested in New Mexico and was awaiting trial on charges of kidnapping, child trafficking, and racketeering. The Gutierrez family had been granted immunity in exchange for their cooperation in identifying other children who had been placed through similar networks. But for Sarah, the legal proceedings felt distant and irrelevant compared to the daily work of building a life that incorporated both her recovered memories and her emerging understanding of who she wanted to become. She had developed a passion for music that went beyond the lullaby that had led to her rescue, learning to play both guitar and piano while exploring genres ranging from traditional Chinese folk songs to contemporary country music that reflected her Iowa upbringing. Marcus Thompson had become an unexpected fixture in Sarah's life, visiting Cedar Falls monthly to play music with her and serving as a connection to the part of her story that involved her own agency rather than victimization. Their musical collaboration had evolved into a project documenting traditional lullabies from various cultures, with Sarah serving as both researcher and performer. The work had given her a sense of purpose that transcended her identity as a recovered missing child. "Music is like a river," Sarah had written in a school essay about her experiences. "It carries things from one place to another, sometimes across great distances and long periods of time. My grandmother's lullaby traveled from China to Iowa to Tennessee and back to Iowa, carrying pieces of my identity that couldn't be stolen or erased. When I sing that song now, I'm not just remembering who I was or celebrating who I am, I'm also discovering who I might become." The essay had been selected for inclusion in a national anthology about resilience and recovery. But Sarah had declined the invitation to speak at the publication event, preferring to let her words stand without the context of her celebrity as a recovered missing child. She had learned to navigate the public interest in her story with a maturity that impressed adults who struggled with far less complicated circumstances. Mei Chen, now 80 years old, had become the anchor that kept Sarah connected to both her cultural heritage and her recovered memories. They spent every Saturday morning together, tending a garden that included vegetables and herbs from both American and Chinese traditions. Sarah had regained fluency in Mandarin during these weekly sessions, and their conversations had evolved to include topics ranging from family history to contemporary politics to the philosophical questions that occupied Sarah's increasingly sophisticated mind. "You are like the paper boats in our song," Mei Chen told Sarah during one of their gardening sessions in the spring of 2020. "You have traveled far from where you started, through waters that were sometimes calm and sometimes dangerous, but you have found your way to where you belong. The journey changed you, but it did not destroy you." Sarah's return to Cedar Falls had also changed the community in ways that extended beyond the resolution of one family's tragedy. The annual Hope Walk had evolved into a permanent foundation supporting families of missing children throughout the Midwest, providing resources for search efforts and counseling services for families navigating the complex emotions of prolonged uncertainty. Sarah participated in the Foundation's work when she felt comfortable doing so, but she had established clear boundaries about how her story could be used to help others. The media attention that had initially overwhelmed Sarah's return had gradually diminished, replaced by occasional feature stories about her recovery and adaptation. She had learned to give interviews when the circumstances felt appropriate, speaking eloquently about the importance of music in maintaining connections to identity and the possibility of healing from even the most traumatic experiences. But she had also learned to decline requests that seemed exploitative or that might interfere with her ongoing development as a normal teenager. High school had brought new challenges and opportunities for Sarah, who was academically gifted but socially cautious in ways that reflected her unusual childhood experiences. She had formed close friendships with a small group of classmates who knew her story but treated her as Sarah, rather than as the girl who had been kidnapped and recovered. These relationships had given her confidence to participate in school activities, ranging from academic clubs to musical performances. The question of what had happened during Sarah's 8 missing years remained partially unanswered, though therapy had helped her recover fragments of memory that painted a picture of her experiences during captivity. She had been moved frequently during the first few years, living with different families who believed they were providing temporary care for a child whose relatives were unable to care for her. The conditioning that erased her original identity had been gradual and systematic, implemented by professionals who understood how to manipulate children's memories and emotional attachments. But Sarah had also retained more of her original identity than her captors had realized. The lullaby her grandmother had taught her had survived in her memory alongside fragments of other experiences that had been too deeply embedded to erase completely. Her recovery had been possible not just because Marcus Thompson had recognized the song, but because Sarah herself had preserved connections to her past that no amount of conditioning could completely destroy. As Sarah approached her 14th birthday in the fall of 2020, she had begun making plans for her future that incorporated both her recovered past and her emerging sense of possibility. She was considering colleges with strong music programs, thinking about careers that might allow her to work with other survivors of trafficking or disappearance, exploring ways to use her experiences to help children who were still missing or who had been recovered and were struggling with their own transitions. The backyard where Sarah had disappeared 8 years earlier had been transformed into a community garden, tended by volunteers, and used to teach local children about nutrition and environmental stewardship. Sarah occasionally visited the garden, not to relive her disappearance, but to appreciate the way something positive had grown from the sight of her family's greatest trauma. On quiet evenings, Sarah would sit with her grandmother on the porch of their new house, humming the lullaby that had brought her home while watching the Cedar River flow past their neighborhood toward destinations unknown. The paper boats in the song had completed their journey, but the river itself continued flowing, carrying new stories toward futures that remained unwritten. Sarah Chen Morrison had learned that identity was not something that could be stolen or erased, but something that could be damaged and healed, lost and found, carried away and brought home by the currents of music and memory that connected her to the people who had never stopped believing she would return. The girl who had vanished from a backyard in Cedar Falls had become a young woman who understood that home was not just a place, but a collection of relationships, traditions, and songs that could survive even the longest journeys down the most dangerous rivers. The lullaby continued, passed from grandmother to granddaughter to the next generation that would carry it forward, a melody that had proven stronger than distance, more durable than time, more powerful than the forces that had tried to silence it forever. In the end, love had indeed brought the paper boats home, carried not by the river's current but by the unbreakable connections that bind families together across any distance, through any darkness, beyond any doubt that they will find each other again. If stories like Sarah's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the melodies of love continue to play, waiting to guide us home.